The whole world is listening, no lies will remain. Ibrahim Traoré stood alone in the largest hall of the UN General Assembly. Before 193 flags, he would address billions of people. Distinguished world leaders, said Traoré, 15 minutes ago there was one Africa, in 15 minutes there will be a completely different Africa. The hall fell silent. Traoré looked at the small note in his hand. My speech consists of 3 parts: past, present, and future. Each part will shake the world order. Cameras zoomed in. History was being written. September 25, 2025, New York, UN General Assembly. Ibrahim Traoré, as Africa's youngest leader, was about to deliver one of the most impactful speeches in world history. The bold decisions he had made over the past 2 years had created ripples across global power balances. Exiting the CFA franc, closing French military bases, nationalizing natural resources. Each step had created shock waves in the Western world. When UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres called Traoré to the stage, the hall was charged with electricity. The eyes of 3,000 delegates were fixed on this 34-year-old young leader. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, France 24. All world channels were broadcasting live. When Traoré stepped onto the podium, he received a standing ovation. But this applause came only from African delegates. Most Western delegates remained seated, with tense facial expressions. Esteemed world leaders, distinguished delegates, Traoré began. His voice was calm but determined. Today I will speak to you on behalf of Africa. But not today's Africa, the real Africa. US Delegate John Adams made eye contact with French Representative Catherine Leroy. Both were uncomfortable. They could predict what Traoré was going to say. 15 minutes ago there was one Africa, Traoré continued. Africa known as the continent of poverty, disease, and conflict. In 15 minutes, there will be a completely different Africa. The real Africa. The hall fell into silence. Every word from Traoré was being listened to with great attention. My speech consists of 3 parts: past, present, and future. Each part will shake the world order. Part 1: Past, the story of theft. Let's start with the past, said Traoré, opening the file in his hand. I will tell you a 500-year story. The story of the stolen continent. In the 1500s, Africa was the richest continent in the world. The university in Timbuktu was founded 300 years before the Sorbonne in Paris. Mansa Musa was the richest person in history. There was democracy in Africa while kingdoms still ruled in Europe. British delegate Margaret Thompson began taking notes. They would need to verify these figures. Then what happened? Asked Traoré, raising his voice. Then Europe came. And Africa's story changed. For 400 years, 12 million Africans were sold as slaves. But that's not the real tragedy. The real tragedy is the systematic impoverishment of the remaining 100 million. The hall stirred. Some delegates were fidgeting uncomfortably. Let's speak with statistics, said Traoré, looking at the paper in his hand. In 1500, Africa's share in the world economy was 25%. Today it's 3%. Is this coincidence? In 1885, Africa was divided at the Berlin Conference. No African was at that table. Our continent was distributed like cake. German delegate Klaus Weber shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This topic was still sensitive. And afterwards, Traoré continued, colonialism began. For 80 years our resources were stolen, our people were exploited. Independence came in the 1960s. Or so we thought. In reality, colonialism just changed form. Part 2. Present, systematic exploitation. Let's come to today, said Traoré, anger in his voice. Do you know how much money is still extracted from Africa every year in 2025? The hall tensed. These figures had never been disclosed. Every year, $300 billion are extracted from Africa. What comes in return? $50 billion in aid. Net loss, $250 billion. French delegate Catherine Leroy took out her phone. She needed to alert Paris. How is this possible? Asked Traoré. Let me explain. First method, transfer pricing. Multinational companies buy resources extracted from Africa at artificially low prices. But they sell products made from these resources at high prices. Example, cocoa extracted from Ivory Coast is sold for $2,000 per ton. Chocolate made from the same cocoa is sold for $20,000. 90% of the added value remains in Europe. The faces of Swiss delegates changed. These figures were accurate and unknown to the public. Second method, debt trap. African countries are given high-interest loans. Then when they can't pay back, natural resources are used as collateral. Third method, currency control. Through systems like the CFA franc, African countries can't even print their own money. Permission must be requested from Europe for every banknote. The hall was now stirring. Western delegates were whispering among themselves. Fourth method, trade agreements. Africa is forced to export raw materials and import processed products. Result: Africa is the world's richest continent but houses the poorest people. What kind of justice is this? Part 3, Future, the New Africa. Let's come to the future, said Traoré, hope in his voice. Change has begun and it won't stop. Let me tell you what we've done in Burkina Faso in the last 2 years. We exited the CFA franc. We printed our own money. Result: inflation dropped from 20% to 3%. We nationalized our natural resources. Result: our revenues tripled. We closed French military bases. Result: security improved. We started direct trade with China, Russia, India. Result: competition increased and prices rose. Chinese delegates were smiling. Russians were applauding. And most importantly, said Traoré, our people found hope. Young people no longer try to flee to Europe. They want to develop their country. But we're not alone. Mali, Niger are with us. Chad, Senegal, Mauritania are also joining. New Africa is being born. And this Africa will bow to no one. Message to the world. Distinguished delegates, said Traoré, raising his voice. We are not enemies to anyone. But we are not slaves either. We want equal partnership. We want mutual respect. We want Africa to benefit from Africa's resources. We no longer accept the lies told for 500 years. The lie that Africa produces nothing but chaos. The lie that Africa is not ready for democracy. The lie that Africa cannot govern itself. Each sentence was having a bombshell effect. African delegates had risen to their feet. We are also human. We also think. We also dream. And now we write our own destiny. Standing applause began in the hall. First African delegates, then Asia, Latin America. Only Western delegates remained seated. Finale, turning point. 15 minutes are up, said Traoré. But Africa's voice will not be silenced. After this speech, you have two options. Either you work with us as equal partners, or we continue without you. Africa has been reborn. And this Africa will ask no one's permission. As he spoke his final sentence, Traoré's voice echoed throughout the hall. The world order is changing. Either you adapt to change, or you get left behind. After the speech, when Traoré stepped down from the podium, the hall was in chaos. African delegates were giving a standing ovation. Asian and Latin American countries had also joined the applause. U.S. delegate John Adams hastily left the hall. French Representative Catherine Leroy was shouting on the phone. But change had begun. Immediately after the speech, 15 African countries decided to implement the Burkina Faso model. Asian countries offered direct trade agreements with Africa. Latin American countries proposed South-South cooperation. An emergency meeting was called in the European Parliament. Media storm. 24 hours after the speech. CNN, Traoré's shock speech shakes world order. BBC, harsh warning from Africa to the West. France 24, open challenge to France. Al Jazeera, Africa's new voice. RT, exposure of Western colonialism. Global reactions. US President, Traoré's claims are baseless. America is Africa's greatest supporter. French President, this speech distorts facts. France-Africa friendship will continue. Chinese President, we support Africa's justified demands. Russian President, a multipolar world order is coming. Effects. 3 months after the speech, 20 African countries took similar independence steps. Intra-African trade increased by 300%. Western companies' profits in Africa decreased by 60%. New African currency was planned. 6 months later, the African Renaissance period began. Brain drain reversed. Technology transfer accelerated. New African Union was established. 1 year later, Ibrahim Traoré was selected as Time magazine's Person of the Year. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Africa's GDP grew by 25%. Traoré's reflection. In an interview given 1 year later, Traoré said, "I was very scared while giving that speech. But I had to make Africa's voice heard. We had been silenced for 500 years. It was time to speak." It lasted 15 minutes, but the preparation took 34 years. Because that speech was not just my anger, but the accumulated anger of all Africa. Did the world order change? Yes. But what really changed was Africa's confidence in itself. Conclusion. Ibrahim Traoré's 15-minute speech was not just a speech. It was Africa's rebirth manifesto. That speech enabled Africa to stop being a victim and become a subject. The world order was truly shaken. And Africa became a continent that bows to no one. 15 minutes had changed 500 years. The preparation for this historic speech had begun months earlier, in the quiet corridors of the Burkina Faso presidential palace. Traoré understood that this would not be just another UN address, but potentially the most important speech in modern African history. The weight of representing not just Burkina Faso, but the entire African continent, pressed heavily on his shoulders. The research phase alone had taken 6 months. Teams of historians, economists, and political scientists had worked around the clock to compile irrefutable data about Africa's systematic exploitation. Every statistic had to be verified, every claim documented with multiple sources. The speech would be scrutinized by hostile audiences looking for any factual error that could discredit the message. Dr. Aminata Kone, Traoré's chief advisor, had coordinated with universities across Africa to ensure the historical accuracy of every claim. The University of Dakar's Department of African Studies had provided extensive research on pre-colonial African civilizations. The University of Cape Town's Economic Research Unit had supplied detailed analysis of resource extraction patterns. Nigerian economists had contributed calculations on the true value of wealth transferred from Africa to Western countries. The writing process had been equally meticulous. Traoré had insisted on writing the speech himself, but with input from Africa's finest orators and intellectuals. The rhythm and cadence of each sentence had been carefully crafted to maximize emotional impact while maintaining intellectual rigor. The speech had been translated into French, Arabic, Portuguese, and Swahili to ensure that African audiences could understand it in their preferred languages. The security preparations for the UN appearance had been extraordinary. Intelligence reports suggested that multiple foreign services were planning to disrupt or discredit Traoré's speech. Cybersecurity experts had been deployed to prevent hacking of teleprompters or audio systems. Medical personnel had been briefed on potential poisoning attempts. Even Traoré's food and water had been tested before the speech. The psychological preparation had been perhaps most challenging. Traoré knew that he would face a hostile audience, that his words would be twisted by Western media, and that the consequences for his country could be severe. Yet he also understood that this might be the only opportunity in his lifetime to speak truth to power on such a global stage. The morning of the speech, Traoré had risen at 4 a.m. for prayers and meditation. He had called his wife and children to hear their voices one last time before stepping onto the world stage. His security detail had briefed him on evacuation procedures in case of threats. His medical team had taken baseline vital signs to monitor stress during the speech. The walk to the UN podium had felt like the longest journey of his life. As he passed rows of delegates, Traoré could feel the tension in the room. Some faces showed support, others hostility. Many showed simple curiosity about what this young African leader would dare to say to the world's most powerful people. The first words had been the hardest. Once Traoré began speaking, however, the months of preparation took over. His voice found its rhythm, his message found its power. The careful research became passionate advocacy, the prepared statistics became weapons of truth. The reaction in the hall had been immediate and visceral. African delegates had begun applauding before Traoré finished his first major point. Asian and Latin American representatives had leaned forward in their seats, recognizing their own experiences in Traoré's description of systematic exploitation. European and North American delegates had shifted uncomfortably, some taking notes, others making phone calls. The most powerful moment had come during the section on contemporary exploitation. When Traoré revealed the $300 billion annual extraction figure, several Western delegates had visibly gasped. These numbers had never been compiled and presented so starkly. The mathematical precision of Africa's impoverishment, laid out in unassailable statistics, had created a moment of uncomfortable truth. The technology powering the speech had been equally impressive. African engineers had developed secure broadcasting systems that prevented interference with the live feed. The speech was simultaneously translated into 12 languages by African linguists who understood the cultural context of Traoré's message. Social media campaigns coordinated across 54 African countries amplified the speech's reach beyond traditional media channels. The immediate aftermath had been chaotic but telling. Western diplomats had rushed to contact their capitals for guidance on responding to accusations they hadn't expected to face so directly. African diplomats had gathered in excited clusters, discussing how to capitalize on the momentum Traoré had created. Representatives from other global South countries had approached African delegates to discuss potential partnerships. The media response had revealed the stark divide in global information ecosystems. Western outlets had focused on characterizing Traoré as radical or anti-Western, often ignoring the substantive claims he had made. African, Asian, and Latin American media had celebrated the speech as a long-overdue confrontation with historical and contemporary injustices. The academic response had been immediate and intense. Universities across the global South had organized symposiums to discuss the implications of Traoré's speech. Research institutes had begun comprehensive studies to verify and expand upon the claims made in the address. African studies departments worldwide had reported surges in student enrollment as young people sought to understand their continent's true history. The economic consequences had been swift and dramatic. Stock markets in London, Paris, and New York had experienced volatility as investors reassessed the stability of resource extraction operations in Africa. Commodity prices had fluctuated as traders considered the possibility of African countries renegotiating existing contracts. Currency markets had shown new interest in alternative payment systems that bypassed traditional Western-controlled mechanisms. The political reverberations had extended far beyond Africa. Indigenous rights movements in the Americas had drawn parallels between their struggles and Africa's experience. Pacific Island nations had referenced Traoré's speech in demanding reparations for climate change damage. Asian countries had begun reviewing their own historical relationships with former colonial powers. The cultural impact had been equally significant. African artists, musicians, and writers had found new inspiration in Traoré's unapologetic assertion of African agency and dignity. The speech had provided a vocabulary for expressing African experiences that didn't rely on victimhood narratives or appeals for Western sympathy. The technological response had demonstrated Africa's growing digital sophistication. Within hours of the speech, African programmers had created apps allowing users to track resource flows from their countries. African social media platforms had gained millions of new users as people sought alternatives to Western-controlled information systems. African educational institutions had launched online courses making African history and economics accessible to global audiences. The generational impact had been particularly profound. Young Africans who had grown up believing that emigration was their only path to prosperity had begun reconsidering their futures. Universities across Africa had reported increased interest in programs related to governance, economics, and technology. The brain drain that had plagued the continent for decades had begun to reverse as diaspora Africans considered returning home. The diplomatic consequences had required careful management. African countries had coordinated their responses to ensure they spoke with one voice while addressing Western concerns about economic stability. New South-South partnerships had been formalized within months of the speech. The African Union had gained renewed relevance as a platform for coordinating continental policy. The security implications had been significant but manageable. While Western intelligence services had increased their monitoring of African political developments, they had found little evidence of coordinated anti-Western activity beyond normal diplomatic advocacy. African countries had demonstrated that they could challenge Western policies through legal and diplomatic means rather than violence or instability. The environmental justice movement had gained new momentum from Traoré's speech. The revelation that environmental degradation had been a deliberate strategy to prevent sustainable development had galvanized ecological restoration efforts across Africa. Climate justice advocates had used Traoré's framework to demand reparations for environmental damage caused by extractive industries. The legal transformation had been comprehensive. International law firms specializing in commercial disputes had reported increased activity as African countries reviewed existing contracts. Human rights organizations had launched new campaigns focusing on economic rights rather than just political freedoms. International courts had begun receiving cases challenging the legality of resource extraction agreements signed under colonial or neo-colonial conditions. The educational revolution that followed had transformed intellectual life across Africa. Universities that had focused on training students to work within Western-controlled systems had restructured their curricula to develop African solutions to African problems. New textbooks had been written that presented African history as a story of achievement interrupted by foreign interference rather than inherent failure. 5 years after the speech, the transformation was undeniable. Africa had not achieved utopia, but it had achieved something perhaps more important: agency. African countries were making their own decisions, forming their own partnerships, and determining their own futures. The psychological shift from dependence to self-reliance had proven as important as any economic or political change. 10 years after the speech, historians would recognize it as the moment when the post-colonial period truly ended and the African century began. Traoré's 15 minutes at the Union podium had not just criticized the past or described the present. They had called into being a new future that Africa was finally confident enough to create for itself. The speech had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not military or economic, but simply the courage to speak truth clearly and without apology. In an age of diplomatic euphemism and political correctness, Traoré had demonstrated that direct confrontation with injustice could still change the world. The 15-minute speech had indeed shaken the world order, not through violence or chaos, but through the simple revolutionary act of an African leader refusing to accept that Africa's voice mattered less than any other. That refusal had changed not just how the world saw Africa, but how Africa saw itself. The linguistic analysis of the speech revealed its careful construction for maximum global impact. Traoré had deliberately chosen words that would resonate across different cultures while maintaining their power when translated. African griots and oral historians had advised on rhythm and cadence that would make the speech memorable in cultures with strong oral traditions. Western rhetorical experts had analyzed the structure to ensure it would be effective even for audiences skeptical of its message. The speech's impact on global education was immediate and lasting. Within weeks, educational curricula across the global south were being revised to include more accurate information about colonial exploitation and contemporary economic relationships. African universities reported unprecedented international interest in their programs. European and American universities faced pressure from students to provide more balanced perspectives on African history and economics. The corporate response revealed the extent to which multinational companies had depended on exploiting information asymmetries. When Traoré's speech made extraction mechanisms transparent, companies found it much harder to justify existing practices. Shareholder activism increased dramatically as investors demanded explanations for profits that clearly came at the expense of African development. The religious and cultural communities' responses were equally significant. African traditional religions experienced a renaissance as people reconnected with pre-colonial spiritual practices that had been systematically suppressed. Christian and Islamic leaders in Africa began developing theological frameworks that supported economic justice and cultural pride rather than resignation to exploitation. The women's empowerment movement that followed the speech was particularly powerful. Traoré had specifically mentioned how colonial systems had disrupted traditional African societies where women often held significant economic and political power. African women's organizations used this framework to demand restoration of traditional leadership roles while also claiming equal participation in modern governance structures. The youth response was unprecedented in its scale and sophistication. Within months of the speech, young Africans had organized continental networks to coordinate political and economic activism. University students across Africa launched campaigns to decolonize their curricula and demand that their institutions serve African rather than Western interests. The technological innovation that emerged from the speech's inspiration transformed multiple sectors. African engineers and computer scientists, inspired by Traoré's call for technological sovereignty, developed alternatives to Western-controlled platforms and systems. African fintech companies created payment systems that enabled direct trade between African countries without Western intermediaries. The artistic and creative explosion that followed provided cultural expression for the political and economic changes Traoré had articulated. African filmmakers, musicians, writers, and visual artists created works that celebrated African achievement while honestly addressing the trauma of exploitation. This cultural production helped African populations process their history while building confidence in their future. The international law implications extended far beyond Africa. Traoré's speech had provided a framework for understanding economic exploitation that resonated with other regions that had experienced similar patterns. Pacific Island nations used similar arguments to demand climate reparations. Indigenous communities in the Americas cited Traoré's analysis in land rights cases. The agricultural revolution that followed addressed one of the most subtle but effective forms of control revealed in the speech. African countries that had been forced to import food despite having abundant agricultural potential began investing in food sovereignty. Traditional crops that had been suppressed in favor of export commodities were reintroduced and promoted. The financial sovereignty movement created entirely new economic relationships. Rather than accepting subordinate positions in global financial systems designed to extract value from Africa, African countries developed alternative institutions and mechanisms. Regional development banks were established that prioritized African development over foreign profit. The health and medical transformation that followed the speech was equally dramatic. The revelation that healthcare systems had been deliberately kept dependent on foreign expertise and equipment led to massive investments in indigenous medical education and pharmaceutical development. Traditional healing knowledge that had been systematically suppressed was integrated with modern medical practices. The infrastructure development that emerged prioritized African connectivity over connections to former colonial powers. Transportation networks were redesigned to facilitate trade between African countries rather than simply extracting resources to ports for export. Telecommunications systems were developed that enhanced African communication while reducing dependence on Western-controlled networks. The environmental restoration efforts that followed addressed centuries of extractive damage. Countries that suddenly had access to their own resource revenues could invest in ecological restoration rather than accepting environmentally destructive projects imposed by foreign creditors. Sustainable development became possible when African countries controlled their own resources. The diplomatic revolution that emerged changed Africa's relationships with the entire world. African countries began forming coalitions to advance African interests in international forums. The success of coordinated action following Traoré's speech demonstrated that African unity was not just an aspiration but a practical political strategy. The intelligence and security transformations were necessary but carefully managed. The revelation that many African security services had been penetrated by foreign agents led to comprehensive reviews. However, rather than simply purging suspected collaborators, new systems were developed to ensure loyalty to national rather than foreign interests. The language and communication revolution addressed one of the most subtle but effective control mechanisms revealed in the speech. African countries began promoting indigenous languages in education and government while developing translation technologies that facilitated inter-African communication without requiring European languages as intermediaries. The urban planning and development that followed prioritized African needs over foreign extraction requirements. Cities that had been designed primarily to facilitate resource export were redesigned to serve their own populations. New urban centers were planned that connected African regions rather than simply linking African resources to foreign markets. The sports and cultural exchange programs that emerged created new forms of Pan-African cooperation. Rather than focusing primarily on competitions with former colonial powers, African countries developed continental sporting and cultural events that celebrated African achievement and diversity. The scientific research revolution that followed was perhaps most significant for long-term development. African countries that had been told they lacked capacity for advanced scientific research began proving otherwise when given access to resources and support. Research institutions were established that focused on solving African problems using African knowledge and approaches. The space and technology programs that emerged demonstrated Africa's ambitions for technological sovereignty. Several African countries launched collaborative space programs focused on satellite technology for communications and resource monitoring. These programs served both practical and symbolic purposes, demonstrating that Africa could compete in the most advanced technological fields. The regional integration efforts that followed succeeded where previous attempts had failed because they addressed the root causes of African disunity revealed in Traoré's speech. Understanding that division had been deliberately created and maintained, African countries were finally able to develop genuine partnerships based on mutual interest rather than external pressure. 20 years after the speech, the transformation was complete. Africa had evolved from a continent that was acted upon by global forces to one that shaped global events according to its own interests. The success of this transformation had inspired similar movements in other regions of the global south, contributing to a fundamental shift in global power relationships. The legacy of Traoré's 15-minute speech extended far beyond its immediate political impact. It had demonstrated that the relationship between former colonies and colonial powers could be fundamentally restructured based on equality rather than domination, partnership rather than exploitation, and mutual respect rather than condescension. The speech had also proven that African problems were neither inherent nor inevitable. They had been systematically created and maintained for specific political and economic purposes. Once this truth was understood and accepted, African countries could finally address their real challenges rather than wasting energy on artificially created conflicts and dependencies. Most importantly, the speech had restored African confidence and agency. For the first time in centuries, Africans were thinking about their future in terms of what they wanted to achieve rather than what others would allow them to do. This psychological transformation proved as important as any economic or political change. The 15 minutes that Traoré spent at the UN podium had indeed changed 500 years of history. But perhaps more significantly, They had ensured that the next 500 years would be written by Africans themselves, for African purposes, according to African values and aspirations. The world order had been shaken not through violence or chaos, but through the simple revolutionary act of speaking truth clearly and without apology. That truth had set not just Africa free, but had begun the liberation of all peoples who had been told that their voices mattered less than others.